Between 1983 and 2000, before the times of peace, there were 3 wars waged on the Vortex. This was the time of the ascended Roseroud's leadership. After being summoned to the Vortex, Roseroud built what is now our organization's headquarters on the Vortex property. After initial negotiations with the Vortex faltered, Roseroud waged her first war. We aim to provide the first official documentation of the happenings and reasonings of these wars, including the infamous Third War on the Vortex, often called the True War. It is important to note that we have been at peace with the Vortex for 24 years. While we will provide coverage of our old wars, the focus of this account will be on this longer-lasting time of peace. The ascended Roseroud spent her first day living on the Vortex property in February of 1983. For the first month, she lived alone, observing and communicating with the Vortex. She kept sacred diaries of these days. These were the days she willfully put herself under the spell of the Vortex. These were her goofy days. In the presence of spiritual vortexes, many will feel elated, happy, silly, or goofy. This is a deceptive tactic of the Vortex. Roseroud, however, was merely leading the Vortex on. After 1 month of her goofy days, she would begin negotiations with the Vortex. But first, she would need to ascend the Vortex. The goofy days and the dewy grass on the Vortex property made it clear that the Vortex was in an active state of mass haunting. Roseroud ceased her goofy days and began collecting every drop of dew on the property in order to infuse it into a defense potion in preparation for the potential dire event of spiritual warfare. In order to begin negotiations with a spiritual vortex, one must first ascend the vortex. In order to ascend a spiritual vortex, one must first pinpoint its core. To locate a vortex core is a delicate and difficult task only achievable by the most powerful of spiritualists. Luckily, Roseroud was the greatest psychic medium to ever live. In April of 1983, Roseroud began mapping the vortex. To aid her in this immense task, she was joined by fellow psychic medium Donna Heshley and spiritual healer Turgo Tapid. The results of the mapping project revealed the scope of their enemy, a core measuring no more than 30 yards and rising over a mile into the sky. Once the core was pinpointed, Roseroud began her work and made multiple attempts to ascend the vortex to begin negotiations. She failed in her first 5 attempts. Donna Heshley and Turgo Tapid were Roseroud's primary allies in these early days, and they both had very different views. One of Roseroud's early mentors, Donna Heshley, felt peace must be pursued. The young and fiery Turgo Tapid, however, felt war must be immediately declared on the vortex. The disagreement would lead to the fracturing of Roseroud and Donna Heshley's relationship, as Roseroud would eventually side with Turgo Tapid and declare war. After 5 failed attempts, there was growing concern amongst the trio that ascension would not be possible. It was, of course, the 6th effort that worked. A veil was placed around the core and wrapped around Roseroud. She sat in the center of the core for 5 hours and 21 minutes on May 2nd, 1983, and then she ascended. She was the first person ever recorded achieving ascension of a spiritual vortex. She returned from ascension 36 minutes later. Rose Roud would never divulge details of her ascension, saying it was part of her agreement with the vortex. She would ascend an undisclosed number of times in that month of May. These were the first negotiations with the vortex. The return of Hefferton was a significant occurrence. A year prior, Rose Roud sent her soldier Hefferton on a journey to assemble a team. Deathbed drove Hefferton and his team of 8 assembled psychic warriors from the airport to the vortex property. These were the initial 8. En route, Turgot warned Hefferton Rose Roud was not pleased with his return. She had just achieved her first ascension of the vortex, and she saw Hefferton's returning as a disturbing disruption, and she questioned what he had been up to in his travels. Upon seeing Hefferton and meeting his initial 8, Rose Roud quickly determined that they were not up to task. She sent them into the vortex property to locate the GNOME. Hefferton, meanwhile, was angry with Rose Roud for embarrassing him in front of the initial 8. She had called him mean things, and this had hurt his feelings. Hefferton, despite being a skilled empath, was also in fact a drunken, gambling addict. He will not be portrayed positively in this accounting of events. The initial 8 were weak. They all gave up on their task of locating the GNOME within a single day. Rose Roud had to punish Hefferton for wasting her time. She sent him into the vortex property to locate the GNOME himself. Hefferton was more skilled than the initial 8, and he found the GNOME quickly. The infamous story of Hefferton and the GNOME is a long story and will be dealt with in a later video series. Please limit questions about this incident and other GNOME incidents until it is properly addressed. We understand there is curiosity and anger toward our perceived secrecy regarding our GNOMEs, but we assure this is only for the purpose of public safety. Hefferton's next task would be to do what he had been originally asked to do: assemble a team. After the failure of the initial 8 came the Wondrous 5. One of the Wondrous 5 was named Garner Garrison. His role in the events of the vortex would be transformative. While the Wondrous 5 laid defensive potion around the property, it would be the Californian psychic from Canada named Garner Garrison who disobeyed Rose Roud's orders and walked into the vortex core. Garner Garrison ascended the vortex. But unlike Rose Roud, he did not return after negotiations. He was held there, suspended in the air. During the time of Garner Garrison being suspended half a mile in the air, 3 of the remaining Wondrous 4 and Hefferton called on Rose Roud to cease negotiations and declare war on the vortex immediately. Rose Roud, infuriated with both Garner Garrison and the vortex for mocking her, had Hefferton shoot Garner Garrison to death in the air. His body remained suspended in the air for another week before it splattered to the ground. The date of the splattering was July 5th, 1983. The first war on the vortex had begun. As the sky turned pink on July 5th, 1983, Rose Roud walked into her meditation chambers and pressed a white button and thus activated her primary apparatus of spiritual warfare, the keradisk. The keradisk was developed by Rose Roud and her longtime lover in the early 70s. While other tools are necessary for a keradisk to operate, for now, we will focus specifically on the keradisk device. Hefferton and the Wondrous 4 positioned the keradisk to point away from the vortex core. They applied defensive potion around the property. Meanwhile, Rose Roud sat in her commander base. Her meditation chamber was a place of great power. She soaked in her buke and radiated attack energies. She aimed to assure the vortex would be sorry it had challenged the ascended Rose Roud.
I have lost the ear of Rose. I had her ear, and now it belongs to Turgo, that slimy wench. I loathe her to my core. A line forms outside Turgo's tent every evening. She heals individually, then she proceeds into the living area for group healing. I tire of Turgo. I resent her healing and feel she is instead performing spells on me. I've spoken this to Rose, but alas, I have lost her ear. This war is not necessary. Turgo, now that she has Rose's ear, she eggs her on. She says, more war. I say less. I say cease. The Vortex does not want war, it wants communication. We are communicators with the spiritual realm. We are not warriors, but Turgo sees herself a warrior. She, the healer. The medic is our grand champion of war. What an irony. I rage so much lately, and I don't know if it's the Vortex or Turgo ensnaring me. I keep these journals so I am not forgotten or misrepresented by those around me. I rage so much. I used to matter around here. I used to matter to her. Now she levitates above us all, above me. She claims to be the greatest psychic medium to ever live. Well, I taught her much. The ascended Rose scares me. She no longer allows us to look into her eyeballs, for she has grown too powerful in these times of war. I miss looking into her eyeballs. I yearn to look into her eyeballs again. There. I said it. I am not a fool. I am Donna Heshley, and I will have the ear of my commander once more. The date is July 19th, 1983. The time is 7:41 at night. Fucking wench.
On August 10th, 1983, the greatest battle of the First War commenced, the 31-hour battle. Rose Roud awoke at dawn and assembled her team in the living area. It was the first time they had seen her since the war began. They were all ordered to avoid eye contact during this meeting. It has been said, but never confirmed, that Rose Roud was over 11 feet tall during this rousing address to her soldiers. She made it clear, the time to attack was now. They would engage in the tactic of shock and awe. She commanded her army to surround the Vortex Core. They engaged in direct spiritual warfare for 31 hours. During the battle, the soldiers worked in shifts. All but one, Bishop Garrison, the empath and twin brother of deceased Garner Garrison, did not take a single break. He stood by the Vortex Core absorbing and projecting energies for all 31 hours. Prior to this, Bishop Garrison had been considered a joke. He was not taken seriously by any of the other wondrous four. They mocked him behind his back for effeminately weeping about his dead twin brother, and Rose Roud commented often that she wished it had been Bishop Garrison who died instead of his brother. Following the 31-hour battle, Rose Roud declared the Vortex greatly weakened, and the shock and awe endeavor a success. She then proclaimed Bishop Garrison to be her new second-in-command, shockingly choosing him over Donna Heshley and Turgo Tapped. Rose Roud shunned all but Bishop Garrison for the remaining month of August. She met privately with Bishop Garrison every day, and she allowed him to look into her eyeballs. As intense resentments over the promotion and special treatment of Bishop Garrison began to grow, the counterattack of the Vortex loomed.
I'm better than them. So much better than them. They mock me. I spend so much time with her now. She lets me in, she lets me see. I know more than them, and they are furious about this. I miss my brother, but I also know his death was fate. I know it led me to her. I believe she's going to give me this Vortex. I believe she's going to teach me to ascend. The Vortex is weakening. The headaches are less intense. The grass is less dewy. The Vortex sees me standing next to the ascended Rose, and it is scared. The Vortex saw what I did during the battle. It sees me as a warrior, a manly and tough, muscled warrior who rarely cries. Hefferton the fat man and Turgo the twat are plotting against me. They meet every night. I see them and the device they work on. It's called a feshp or something. They claim it a game changer. I, Bishop Garrison, I am the game changer of this war. The others don't let me sit with them during supper time. The Ascended Rose doesn't allow anyone to witness her eating during wartime. I believe it is because she is shy about the ectoplasmic goo she leaks from her eyes. But I would never judge her. So I eat alone. All alone. I eat my gravy and beans alone, and no one else can have them. They eat their special foods. I hope they choke on them. But I also do not care. Because they are beneath me. They are beneath myself and my eternal commander and my new best friend, the Ascended Rose. The date is August 29th, 1983. The time is 3:36 in the morning.
That morning, everyone woke to a mood of exuberance. The spiritualists, who had been angry with one another and engaged in conflict, decided to frolic giddily together on the fields. They did funny walks and made silly voices to one another. There was joy in the air, and there was no dew in the grass. No one had a headache. The war was clearly over, said Bishop Garrison. Rose Rout agreed. Thus, the first war was declared mission accomplished. Victory would be celebrated. If Rose Rout had not been weakened by her valiant war efforts, she would see the obvious, that the Vortex was playing a trick on her. The Vortex would engage in a months-long period of deceptive peace. Similar to the Goofy Days, this would be a period of pure joy. Unlike the Goofy Days, however, the deceptive peace was not a trick being played by Rose Rout. She had actually been fooled by the Vortex. Turgot Tappet warned Rose Rout immediately. She was being misled by her enemy and her new so-called ally, Bishop Garrison. One night, the spiritualists got naked and danced by the fire. They showed each other their silly walks and funny voices. The Vortex watched their derangement from the distance, gaining strength and preparing for the Second War. On December 16th, it would strike them with a ferocious and shocking blow. It was everywhere. It bubbled from the grass. It dripped from trees. On the morning of December 16th, 1983, the deceptive peace came to a startling close, and the Second War began. Ectoplasmic goo was the artillery of choice for this grand attack by the Vortex. The spiritualists spent the following week cleaning and collecting the ectoplasmic goo, which made them all gravely ill. A great dispute occurred over what to do with the goo. Some wanted it to be burned. Some wanted it to be dumped in the lake. It was Turgot Tappet, however, that demanded the goo be preserved in a special buplin. Rose Rout, feeling that preserving the goo would be too dangerous, decided to burn the goo during a ritual. Some have suggested that this burning of the goo was a false flag event, and that the real ectoplasmic goo was preserved in a secret buplin deep in the woods. These rumors have never been verified and are considered conspiratorial. The Second War lasted a mere 19 days. All of Rose Rout's spiritualists lay incapacitated by the Vortex. Bishop Garrison spent the entire Second War hiding like a coward, weeping inside of a bathroom tub on the property. It was Rose Rout, alone, who defeated the Vortex and won the Second War. Some of the only records from this period of 19 days are from Rose Rout's personal journals. These journals would not be understandable by a non-ascended person and will not be shared. In summary, they made one thing clear. Rose Rout alone stunningly defeated the Vortex, weakening it to a point that it no longer swirled and could no longer inflict its spells. She defeated the Vortex herself alone, with the help of absolutely no one else, the Ascended Roseroud won the Second War on the Vortex. On January 3, 1984, Roseroud pushed the button to deactivate the keradisk. Thus began the Ascended Era. 13 years where the spiritualists maintained what they assumed to be complete control over the Vortex. Roseroud, tremendously weakened from her fight with the Vortex, began what is referred to as the Great Ignoring. She was so disgusted and disappointed by her pathetic army that she refused to speak to them for the remainder of the decade. Her only contact with her soldiers was to frequently appear in their dreams, where she would sternly stare at them from a far distance. The Ascended Era lasted 13 years. It was not a time of peace. Rather, it was a time of dominance. The Great Ignoring persisted. Only Turgo Tapid was permitted speaking time with Roseroud. They met once a week so Roseroud could berate her. Roseroud was said to be so weakened from defeating the Vortex that she was translucent and the size of an infant. She refused to be looked at and spoke from the other side of a veil. While the Great Ignoring was a horrid calamity, the spiritualist would nonetheless find much joy and enrichment in the early days of the Ascended Era. The Vortex energies had dispersed, no longer empowered in a swirling core. Thus, the Wondrous Four and Hefferton finally were able to wield their powers. They controlled the Vortex. They owned the Vortex. They were above the Vortex. On the first day of the Ascended Era, Roseroud would be summoned by a television. On it, she saw a child. Roseroud would become obsessed with this child. This child would change everything, every single thing, and Roseroud knew it as she looked upon the child upon the television. The child's name was Yera Peoples.
I fear that perhaps my time is nearing its conclusion. I am sick. Turgo's potions are no longer working. I worry she isn't even trying to heal me. If I die, let it be known I was a proud woman. The woman who taught the Ascended Rose how to wield her powers and body. But now she doesn't speak to me. She doesn't look at me. No one does except for Turgo the twat, who angrily feeds me my potion every day, throwing at me like a rabid bitch. But at least there is my sweet, soft Harriet. Harriet, sweet, wonderful, silky, gorgeous Harriet. She is ignorant and loyal to the Ascended Rose, but she still is kind enough to spend time with me. And she is kind enough to laugh with me, to nuzzle my forehead and ease me, to give my love a place to flow inside of. Although she has been quite resentful since I moved her hand toward my under region. I was not doing it as a mode of perversion. I was merely showing her the depleted state of my sacral chakra. Oh God, oh dear shit. I hope she returns to the room. I hope she gives me a hug. I worry they've changed the key. I haven't had potion in a while. This is Donna Heshley. The date is May 11th, 1985. Oh dear, I don't want to die.
At Donna Heshley's funeral, Roseroud spoke of her mentor and friend with disappointment and disgust. After delivering her speech, she continued ignoring everyone. She did not let it be known, but she was morbidly depressed by the death of her mentor, and she carried regret over the mean things she had said to her on her deathbed. With Donna Heshley's death, what was once the Wondrous Five, and then the Wondrous Four, was now the Wondrous Three. That night, Roseroud watched with rage as Hefferton buried Donna Heshley. The date was June 22nd, 1985. Roseroud had defeated the Vortex. Her army stood strong, and the Ascended Roseroud's Vortex was slowly becoming a place of prominent power. But even still, She was miserable and isolated. She soaked in her buke and thought of her dead friend. She tried to connect with her that night, but she couldn't. Donna Heshley would not answer back. Rose Roud, the greatest psychic medium to ever live, would try to connect with Donna Heshley every single night until her own death. Donna Heshley never answered back. Harriet Johanna was the third, thus far unmentioned member of the now wondrous three. She was a jack of many trades, an empath, a psychic, a partial healer, and a tarot master. She acted as primary aid to the ascended Rose Roud. During the Great Ignoring, Rose Roud would deliver orders telepathically. Harriet Johanna's primary task was to acquire the child, while Turgot, Bishop Garrison, and Hefferton took great joy in the ascended era. Harriet Johanna was terribly affected by the Great Ignoring. She had taken significant joy in making Rose Roud her breakfast, in cleaning the ascended Rose Roud's robes and face after dinner. But now her days were spent hopelessly pursuing a child celebrity. Meanwhile, a love affair began to swirl. Turgot, Tapped, and Hefferton had grown close during their long development process of a new prototype device, the FESHP. Turgot would often ask Hefferton, why was he not wondrous? Why did he allow Rose Roud to emasculate him? One night, Hefferton watched Harriet Johanna, sobbing, smoking a cigarette by the buplin. It was then that an idea struck him. He would be the one to acquire the child. He would end the Great Ignoring, and he would be proclaimed wondrous once and for all. Being a highly disciplined empath, Bishop Garrison was able to tune into the emotions of others. This, he claimed, is why he spent the entire Second War weeping in the bathtub. Everyone absolutely loathed Bishop Garrison. His only friend was his pen pal, the Hungarian prince. Bishop Garrison wrote to him every day. He was very, very proud that he had a friendship with such an esteemed man. On Christmas of 1987, Bishop Garrison would do something unthinkable. He invited the Hungarian prince to the VORTEX property for supper. As has been clarified many times, there were and are still no visitors allowed to the VORTEX, not even royalty. This was a clear violation of Rose Roud's rule. Bishop Garrison spent the next week engaged in some sort of bizarre slumber party with the Hungarian prince. The other spiritualists reacted in absolute horror as they faced something they hadn't faced in years: company. Rose Roud remained in her room every time the Hungarian prince would visit, in righteous rebuke of her soldiers' mortifying insubordination. He would be taught a painful lesson, because the authority of the ascended Rose Roud would not and could not be challenged. And, as has been made very clear, there were and are no visitors allowed to the VORTEX. The FESHP was a work in progress for years. It wasn't until the summer of 1988 that a working version was placed atop the hill. Rose Roud herself attended the unveiling ceremony, although she stood away from everyone and refused to look at them. The FESHP was a device for assessing vortex intensity. According to the FESHP, however, the vortex was beginning to swirl again, with ferocity. At the ceremony, for a brief moment, the great ignoring was lifted as the ascended Roseroud walked up to Hefferton and slapped him. In front of everyone, in front of his lover Turgo, in front of the vortex itself, she slapped him on the face. She slapped him on the rear. She slapped him and slapped him and slapped him. "How dare you!" she screamed. "I have defeated the vortex. It sits there bowing to me. It does not swirl, and it will never swirl again." She slapped him once more, and she left Hefferton bleeding on the ground. It was a terrible unveiling ceremony. The morning after the slapping, Hefferton left on an airplane to travel to California. He had a plan. He would get very drunk on a series of connecting flights until he was kicked off. From there, he would stay at a series of hotels where he would order food and vomit inside nice bathrooms. Hefferton was very excited about this. He needed some time off after the slapping, and he wanted to avoid seeing his lover Turgo after being repeatedly slapped in front of her. While Hefferton flew over the desert, drunk, sad, and happy, something truly wondrous would happen. Seated next to him on the airplane was a mother and her daughter. Hefferton began talking to the mother and learned she was also a spiritualist. He drunkenly confided all of his shames and humiliations to this mother and child. When he got off the plane, the mother invited Hefferton to join them at an event. Completely intoxicated, Hefferton showed up to the taping of a television show hosted by a child psychic. The lights dimmed, and the announcer shouted, "Please welcome the little girl who can talk to the dead." Hefferton smiled proudly to himself as some puke fell out of his mouth. His plan had worked. He was in. It was a Tuesday morning, January 1989. A delivery truck approached the Vortex property and dropped off a box addressed to Rose Roud. Inside was a crystal ball and a hastily written note. It read, "Be back soon. The great ignoring nears its end." The note smelled of tacky booze and casino carpet.
My rose, I'm a producer now. Be back soon. A big producer now, you see. But the show is coming to an end. It got canceled. The show is coming to an end. They found the boy she said was dead. They found the boy she said was dead. He was alive. She had told the parents to stop looking for him. They found the boy she said was dead. Alive! Oh my God! In a ditch. Alive without a hitch. Oops. She had assured the parents that he was dead. But he was alive! Oops! Assured them he was definitely dead. She told those parents to go ahead and stop looking for him. Saw soon, my rose. Be back soon, my rose. Be back soon, my rose. Be back soon, my rose.
No one, not only. Please welcome the little girl who can talk to the dead, Year of Peoples.
She had told the parents to stop looking for him. Without the boy, she said, was dead. Alive, oh my God, in a ditch. Alive, without a hitch. Oops. She had assured the parents that he was dead, but he was alive. Oops. Assured them he was definitely dead. She told those parents to go ahead and stop looking for their son. Be back soon, my rose. Be back soon, my rose. Be back soon, my rose.
The sky noise started on a brisk March morning. Turgot Tappet's journal described it as a filthy screech. Harriet Johanna said it sounded like a gurgling echo. It came from the sky, above the vortex core. Unusual smells, visuals, and sounds are not unheard of in the proximity of a spiritual vortex, but the suddenness of the sky noise panicked all the spiritualists. If they were truly in the Ascended Era, why would the sky be making such odd noises? Was the Feshp correct? Was the vortex beginning to swirl again? Roseroud stayed in her meditation chamber that whole day. When she came down for supper, the spiritualists asked her to please cease the great ignoring and tell them what the sky noise was. Roseroud ignored them. In truth, she herself was the most upset by the sky noise because she knew exactly what this particular sky noise was. This was a summoning. As the vortex did to her years ago, the vortex was singing out. Throughout the realms, the vortex was calling upon an ascender. Spruggets are root-like structures below ground of an active spiritual vortex. They can be broken and peeled to squeeze sprugget juice from, or ground for sprugget powder. Spruggets must be contained. If spruggets are not contained, they become gnomes. Hefferton had dumped the original gnome in the lake, and the vortex had, of course, been defeated by the ascended Roseroud in the Second War. But one day in the summer of 1989, the Hungarian prince and Bishop Garrison were out frolicking in the fields when they both tripped over a large sprugget. Bishop Garrison knew this confirmed the vortex was swirling again. He knew this likely meant there was a gnome residing on the property. But Bishop Garrison was having fun in the Ascended Era. He did not want the Ascended Era to end, so he buried the sprugget. He found more spruggets in the following days and weeks, and he buried each one of them as the sky noise continued to bellow from above. It wouldn't be until August that Turgot Tappet caught Bishop Garrison burying a sprugget in the dead of night. She approached him, interrogated him, and made him confess. She then blackmailed him with the information. Bishop Garrison became the spiritual and sexual servant to Turgot Tappet. He spent all of his time serving her. Turgot Tappet, meanwhile, also kept the spruggets a secret and began burying them herself in the same hole. Because if the ascended Roseroud found out about the spruggets, then she would make them all search the property and find the gnome. This was not a task anyone felt like doing, because everyone was busy having so much goddamn fun in the Ascended Era. The helicopter flew over the lake, and it made Hefferton sick. They were getting close. It had been 2 years since Hefferton was on the Vortex property. He sat across from Yura Peoples, now 17 years old, and her mother. In the 2 years, Hefferton had become a producer of Yura's successful television program. She had been the little girl who could talk to the dead until a recent controversy resulted in her show's cancellation and an immediate need for funds. Hefferton had made multiple sexual advances toward the mother until she relented. They were now a disgusting husband and wife. He, Hefferton, now somehow the surrogate father to this infamous child. He looked at his family sitting across from him in the helicopter, both mother and daughter pouting grumpily. In that moment, he had a fantasy, a striking vision. He opened the helicopter window, stuck his head out, and put it into the spinning blades. He felt the rotors clog on his neck fat for a split second as he decapitated himself in front of his fake family and plopped into the lake. From there, he watched the helicopter spin out of control and crash directly into the ascendant Rose Roud, blowing her into 1,000,000 pieces. But alas, he remained in the helicopter. He looked out and saw the Vortex property come into view. Hefferton had returned. And just as he had planned, within an hour, the great ignoring would end, and a new spiritualist would be declared wondrous. Much to his surprise, however, it would not be him. A helicopter landed on the Vortex property. Hefferton got off first. He had gained weight. He approached Turgo Tapid, who spit on his crotch in disgust. He moved on to a chained-up Bishop Garrison, who solemnly nodded at him. Then he approached her. The ascended Rose Roud had not seen Hefferton since the slapping occurred years prior. Rose Roud ignored Hefferton as he approached and whispered something gently in her ear. After he whispered this, Rose Roud turned to Hefferton. She embraced him and gave him a kiss on the forehead. She walked to the helicopter, knelt to her knees, and stretched out her arms. Yira Peoples had arrived, and out she stepped off the helicopter, as striking and magical as Rose Roud had imagined her. Rose Roud stepped forward, tears of happiness gleaming in her eyes. And then, an older woman, the mother of Yira Peoples and bride of Hefferton, stepped off the helicopter. Rose Roud's face dropped. She turned to Hefferton. "Who the fuck is that?" Bishop Garrison walked with a spring in his step. He was delighted. He was on his way to the first party thrown by Rose Roud since the end of the Great Ignoring. Bishop Garrison was eager to talk to Rose Roud once more, to look in her eyeballs, to eat her delicious cake. He hoped the Hungarian prince would be there. He hoped Turgo Tapid would be nice to him tonight. As he approached, he saw PAMMY Peoples, the mother of Yira Peoples and bride of Hefferton, dancing by the lake. She waved to him. He waved back. "Are you going to the party, PAMMY?" Bishop giggled gleefully. He then watched as she repeatedly slammed her own head against a rock until she lay motionless, covered in blood, making a disgusting gurgling noise. Bishop Garrison stood frozen in shock, watching the gurgling woman for a full 10 minutes before he sprinted to inform the others of what he saw. He entered the party and screamed, "The child's mother is dead! She bashed her head into a rock by the lake." "My mother is dead!" shouted Yira Peoples, horrified. "Yes, yes! She is gurgling blood by the lake! It's awful!" As everyone panicked, Bishop Garrison walked up to Hefferton. "I'm sorry for your loss." "What loss?" "Didn't you hear?" said Bishop Garrison. "Your wife is dead. She broke her head by the lake." Hefferton stared off. "Shame. She would have loved this cake." After Patty Peoples died, a mood of suspicion and morbidity entrenched the property. Yira Peoples was given a potion to offset her violent state of grief. She stayed under the watch of Turgo Tapid, who comforted her and provided her warmth. Hefferton, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. 5 days, Bishop Garrison led a solo search party to find him. Bishop Garrison came upon a hump in the grass. Inside the hump, he heard the voice of Hefferton. He took out a knife and stabbed the hump. Juices poured out of it. The hump began to subside. He heard the sound of Hefferton screaming in agony. Bishop Garrison, yet again, sprinted back to the residence in a panic. He banged on the door of Rose Roud. She answered her door and saw Bishop crying. She smacked him. "Why do you always run through doors with your tears like some sort of little fairy boy? What sort of soldier are you?" Rose Roud asked. Bishop Garrison composed himself and whimpered, "Ascended Rose, I have awful news. There are gnomes on the property. I found Hefferton inside of one." It is said that at this moment, the rage of Rose Roud was so potent that Bishop Garrison urinated himself in front of her. When he did this, Rose Roud became even angrier and brutally beat him. She spent the next hour beating up Bishop Garrison for delivering such awful news to her. They would soon discover there was not one gnome, not 2 gnomes, not 3 nor 4. No, there were 5 gnomes residing on the Vortex property. 5 gnomes. The reckoning of the 5 gnomes had begun. The spiritualists sat one evening, eating a delicious spaghetti meatball dinner. Hefferton entered the dining room. He was covered in a thick, gooey substance. They hadn't seen him in months. Hefferton smiled bashfully. "May I please have some spaghetti meatball?" he asked. In the months of Hefferton's absence, much had changed. Yira Peoples had taken over as second in command to the ascended Rose Roud. She spent all of her time under the tutelage of her new commander. She was rarely allowed out onto the Vortex property, as Turgo Tapid led the dangerous gnome mapping project. Harriet Johanna, Bishop Garrison, and the Hungarian prince searched the property for hours each day, attempting to locate Hefferton and the 5 gnomes. Every day, Turgo Tapid returned to have supper and be berated by Rose Roud for not finding a single gnome or Hefferton. It was a time of tension. It was a time of jealous simmering. So there Hefferton stood, covered in goo, drunk, on a balmy pink evening, August 10th, 1990. Rose Roud slurped her spaghetti meatball. She stood up and said, "Dear Hefferton, welcome back. We missed you, but your time is now concluded." Hefferton sprinted out the door. Yira Peoples sent spiritual energies toward Hefferton as he ran away. He fell flat on his face. This is how Hefferton broke his face. Rose Roud looked at her pupil and smiled. "The acquired child, you are my favorite person to ever live," Rose Roud cooed proudly. The deathbed of Hefferton was a very nice deathbed. He kept the sheets clean and pleasant smelling. He had placed candy by the bedside in case a friend ever visited. None ever did. It was September 6th, 1993. Hefferton's gnome infection had put him out of commission. He was frail. Hefferton was kept in a broken bublin to avoid the spread of his gnome infection. A tiny man in pointy shoes visited him once a week and gave him a medicine. The medicine made Hefferton's face stop hurting. It made his feet go numb. Hefferton grabbed the tiny man in the pointy shoes and pulled him into his deathbed. "Please," he said, "take me outside. Take me to the Vortex core. I need to ascend." The tiny man in the pointy shoes had been warned about this. He gently touched Hefferton's hand. "I am not allowed to bring you to the Vortex core, Mr. Hefferton," said the tiny man. And then he left. It had been a year since Hefferton saw any of the other spiritualists. He was isolated in a bunker of doom, left to bleed out by his own commander and surrogate daughter. It was September 13th, 1993. The tiny man in the pointy shoes entered the deathbed to give his medicines. But when he went under the covers, Hefferton wasn't there. Hefferton would be found dead, wrapped in the curtains of the Vortex core. He did not ascend because he was not an ascender. He was not wondrous. He was not worthwhile. This is the end of Hefferton's story, and he will not be mentioned ever again. Please never ask about him or say his name from now on. Thank you. For the first time ever, the spiritualists on the Vortex property engaged in a recruitment process. They were seeking a new empath. Rose Rowd demanded this new empath be the best empath, the most skilled empath, a wondrous empath. When the spiritualist world hears that the ascended Rose Rowd is hiring, one would assume applicants would come in droves. No, for a full year, not one single empath applied for the position. All were clearly too cowardly and pathetic. Without an empath, who on earth would read the FESHP? December 20th, 1994. A white Buick approached the Vortex property. It parked. It went through the long entry process before it approached Oliver, the new Vortex security man. "What are you doing here? There are no visitors allowed to the Vortex," said Oliver. The man inside cranked his window down. "I'm here for a job," he said calmly. The man's name was Nettie Hoyt, the strongest empath to ever live. This is the beginning of Nettie Hoyt's story. Nettie Hoyt's interview with Rose Rowd went well. It lasted 13 hours. Nettie Hoyt brought a new energy to the Vortex property. It was almost as if the resentments and spites of the past dissolved upon his arrival. Everyone loved Nettie. Everyone except Yira Peoples. She found the new empath smug. She hated his face. Sometimes she fantasized about cutting his face with a pair of scissors. But Rose Rowd felt much differently. The journals of Rose Rowd reveal she had fallen in love with Nettie Hoyt. She wrote pages of extremely well-told, spiritually erotic fiction about him, and enjoyed watching him get wet and naked in the bath. She was not subtle in her pursuit, and began engaging in inappropriate touching and rubbing during meetings with Nettie. "Ascended Rose, please don't touch me like that," said Nettie. This was the first time Rose Rowd had ever been sexually rejected. She was mortified. Over the following weeks, Rose Rowd gazed on at Nettie with angry lust, while Yira Peoples eyed him with repulsion, until March 15th, 1995. Yira Peoples was assigned to partner with Nettie Hoyt for potion dispersal that morning. They rode the property together, Yira Peoples trying to avoid looking at Nettie's dumb, terrible face. They stopped to insert potion into the first bubblet. When Nettie returned to the four-wheeler, he put the potion bag into the back and climbed next to Yira Peoples. They rode on to the next bubblet in silence until Nettie spoke. "You dislike me?" Yira turned to him. "Yes, I do." "Why?" "I do not like empaths. You feel?" "You are good at feeling." "What good does that do us?" said Yira Peoples. "Also, I do not like your dumb, ugly face." Nettie nodded. "Many enjoy my face," said Nettie. "I do not. Our last empath was a nothing man, a loser. He destroyed my mother. Nettie nodded more. You are angry. Yira Peoples parked the four-wheeler. She slashed Nettie in the face with her nails. Blood splattered. Nettie nodded. Please do that again. She did it again. Once more. She slashed his face once more. The two began to passionately kiss in the four-wheeler. Unfortunately, at this moment, Rose Roud looked out from her meditation room to see her pupil and her new obsession making out in a four-wheeler in the distance. This would create conflict. Friday morning, August 11th, 1995. Bishop Garrison parked outside Pop Mart. He was under direct orders from the ascended Rose Roud to find and procure the collar bell. He went into Pop Mart, said hello to store owner Bob Pop,
Hello, Bob Pop.
and walked immediately to the bell aisle. He grabbed the first bell he saw and brought it to the checkout lane. It was a bright blue, tiny bell. Good morning, said Bob Pop as he scanned the bell. Oh, hello, nice morning. What is your bell return policy? Asked Bishop Garrison. Bells must be returned within the week for a full refund. Please check your bell before leaving to make sure you are satisfied, smiled Bob Pop. Bishop Garrison purchased the bell, walked outside Pop Mart, and went to the payphone across the street. He dialed. A click on the other end. Ring it! Snapped the voice of Rose Roud. Ring it to me! Bishop Garrison held the bell to the phone. He rang it. Silence. No, that is not the bell. Click. She hung up. Bishop Garrison walked back across the street, went back into Pop Mart, walked back up to Bob Pop at the checkout counter. Hello, I need to return this bell. Is it broken? Asked Bob Pop. No, just not the bell for me, said Bishop Garrison, cracking his chapped lips with a pleasant smirk. 14 hours later, Bob Pop watched as the strange man across the street rang a bell into the payphone. The sun was setting. The man walked back to the store, returned the bell, and brought another to the checkout lane. This is the last bell, Bob Pop said. You have purchased and returned all my other bells. Well, let's hope this is the one. Bishop smiled. Bishop Garrison plopped across the street. Yet again, he dialed the payphone, rang the bell into it, and waited. He hung up. He walked back across the street, entered the store. Sir, you have purchased and returned every single bell, said Bob Pop. Bishop Garrison politely smiled. Yes, it turns out it was actually the first bell. Bishop then purchased the bright blue tiny bell and left. 1 week later, Turgo Tapped watched as Bishop Garrison operated a strange panel device in the dining room. What are you doing? Bishop Garrison withheld the truth, but Turgo Tapped was a strong interrogator and potion crafter, so she quickly broke him. Turgo Tapped confronted Rose Roud that night. Ascended Rose, why have you been making the queer man do such odd things with that bell? Asked Turgo. Rose Roud soaked in her buke, dazed. My sweet Donna, she sang, your beauty oozes. Turgo Tapped left the room. Donna Heshley had been dead for over 10 years. Rose Roud had never, not once, gotten someone's name wrong. And why was she making the queer man do such odd things with that bell? Turgo came to a sudden realization. Rose Roud had lost her mind. Her reign was complete. It was time. Time for Turgo Tapped to finally take control of the vortex. Nettie Hoyt called a meeting. Ascended Rose, I have completed my mapping project and have located each gnome. I regret to inform you that the gnomes were being incorrectly mapped by Turgo Tapped and her team. Turgo Tapped scoffed and lit a cigarette, Nettie continued. Also, the vortex core has moved at least 5 feet, and it has grown in size. Turgo lost her temper. She whipped her cigarette at Nettie's face. It bounced off him. Yura Peoples picked the lit cigarette up and threw it back at Turgo Tappet. "How dare you throw a cigarette at me, you motherless cunt," Turgo Tappet hissed. But what Nettie Hoyt said next would silence the room. "Ascended Rose, your vortex is swirling again? It is larger and more powerful than it has ever been. The grass is soaked with dew. Didn't you notice?" Everyone froze. Every single spiritualist except Rose Roud was aware of this. But the last time Rose Roud was informed that the vortex was still swirling was the slapping, when she brutally slapped a former employee for suggesting so. Rose Roud perceived her defeat of the vortex in the Second War as her defining accomplishment and the true testament to her title as the greatest psychic medium to ever live. To suggest the vortex was not under her command was a great affront to her legacy. Everyone waited in the silence for Rose Roud to scream, to stand up and slap Nettie, perhaps slap him to death. But instead, she nodded slowly. "Then I must go back up," she declared. Rose Roud was then wrapped in ascension fabric. She sat in the vortex core, waiting to ascend. The spiritualists waited. "How long does it usually take?" asked Nettie. The only recorded ascension was May 2nd, 1983. Harriet Johanna squeaked, nervously pacing in the corner. "It took 5 hours and 21 minutes. She returned 36 minutes later." "She will not ascend," said Turgo, puffing smoke into Harriet Johanna's face. "Why would you say such a thing about the Ascended Rose?" asked Harriet. "The Ascended Rose Roud was the greatest psychic medium to ever live. The woman out there is not the Ascended Rose Roud. It is a confused old bat who watches trash television all the time." Harriet Johanna gasped. Turgo Tappet blew more smoke into Harriet Johanna's face. "When she returns in an hour, in a confused daze, forgetting why she was out there, I will go to the vortex core. I will ascend. I will not negotiate with the vortex. I will declare war." Turgo took Harriet Johanna's palm. She put her cigarette out in it. "You will be my number 2. Harriet Johanna was exceptionally loyal to Rose Roud, but she was also a weak coward. Also, Turgo Tappet had just hurt her hand very badly with that cigarette, so Harriet Johanna decided to just go along with Turgo's plan for the time being. November 3rd, 1996. 2 in the morning. Turgo Tappet sat in the vortex core, wrapped in ascension fabric for the 37th time since March. Despite her many attempts, she could not ascend. Neither could Rose Roud, who had only made 2 attempts herself. Harriet Johanna kept watch from the attic. If anyone were to find out that Turgo Tappet was attempting to ascend, they would know a coup was underway. The attic door opened. Bishop Garrison entered. "Harriet, what are you doing in the attic?" Harriet Johanna panicked. "I have betrayed the Ascended Rose. I deserve to die," she shouted, hitting herself in the face. Bishop Garrison then realized that Harriet Johanna was in the attic for the same reason as him, to keep watch for Turgo Tappet. He closed the door and left, without saying another word. Turgo Tappet felt that her command over Bishop Garrison and Harriet Johanna would be strategically vital in her attempt to take control of the vortex. Little did she know, an opposing alliance was flourishing. Yira Peoples and Nettie Hoyt, dissatisfied with the other spiritualists, began forming a new plan. November 11th, 1996, Nettie and Yira took a strapped oak chair to their pinpointed spot. They poked the pointy legs of the chair into the moist earth. Nettie strapped himself into the chair while Yira planted 10 rod devices into the ground. Nettie put his fingers into the rods. Yira kissed him tenderly before placing a metallic mask over his face. This was the reader chair, created by Nettie Hoyt when he was merely 9 years old. When operated by a skilled empath, a reader chair allowed one to communicate with the realm between dirt and soul, the gooey place deep within, the place that makes us gurgle. To put it simply, Nettie would use the reader chair to introduce himself to each of the 5 gnomes. He would then begin negotiations with the gnomes. Every day became similar. Turgo would sneak off and try to ascend in the early mornings, with the watchful aid of her dubious duo. Nettie and Yira would set up the reader chair, and Nettie would communicate with the gnomes. And Rose Roud, oblivious to it all, would watch her television, occasionally remembering to perform VORTEX-related tasks. April 11th, 1997. It was Nettie's 9th meeting with Carl, the 3rd gnome. When interacting with a gnome, one must be cautious. Gnomes can be extremely charismatic and fun to be around. They are very silly and good at tickling. Nettie Hoyt was skilled enough to handle it, though. He never acted silly with the gnomes. He never let them see him smile or tickle his sensitive places. When the gnomes acted silly, Nettie would sternly say, "No, we cannot be so silly right now. We must negotiate." And the gnomes respected Nettie Hoyt. So they listened. While Nettie operated the reader chair, Yira Peoples kept him moisturized and fed. Nettie had given strict instructions. "If you see me acting silly, unplug the reader chair." Negotiations were going well, and a deal was nearing. This deal would call for the spiritualists to allow the 5 gnomes to live on the Vortex property with the conditional promise of no gnome attacks and limited proliferation. Constant contact would need to be maintained between the gnomes and Nettie Hoyt for the deal to be upheld. A high antagonistic gnome population makes ascension nearly impossible. Nettie knew this and felt negotiations were the only way to proceed. If the gnomes were on their side, he felt they would aid in ascension. Turgo Tapid also knew this. She disagreed with negotiation. She felt all the gnomes should be slaughtered instead, so she could ascend. May 3rd, 1997. Bishop Garrison walked the property, thinking of his dead twin brother, his dead mother, his dead father, when he noticed something in the distance. Across the lake, a strange vibration caught his eye. Something twitching. He made his way to the other side, falling several times in the dirt. He reached it. He yelped in an effeminate manner. It was a gnome, the first gnome Bishop Garrison had ever seen. Curious, he grabbed a rock and threw it at the gnome. The gnome spasmed and spit goo. It made a strange screeching noise. Bishop Garrison threw another rock at the gnome. He threw another. 1 hour later, Bishop Garrison picked up the final chunk of dismembered gnome and tossed it in the lake. He ran to Turgo Tapid, giddy with joy. "I have done it. I have killed a gnome," said Bishop Garrison, walking into Turgo's room, covered in dead gnome goo. Turgo Tapid would celebrate by having Bishop Garrison pleasure her. She had only 4 gnomes left to slaughter. The next day, Nettie sat in the reader chair, waiting to meet with Tom, the 2nd gnome. Tom would keep Nettie waiting for hours. This was unlike him. It would take days for Nettie to learn what Bishop Garrison had done under the orders of Turgo Tapid. Once he learned that a gnome had been murdered, he knew that his work was all for nothing. The great gnome negotiations were over. The gnomes were angry. the vortex was swirling, and it seemed Turgo Tapid would get her wish once and for all. Complete, total, true war. On the eve of the true war, August 4th, 1997, the ascended Rose Roud watched her television. While the mental capacity of Rose Roud seemed diminished, her psychic powers were growing. She was not, in actuality, watching televised home shopping for 12 hours a day. No. Rose Roud had turned her television into a device, a psychic device. She had, stunningly, learned to ride the airwaves of her television. She rode them into the skies, flying over the entire country like a giant airplane. She would fuse with the fuzzy static until she flung herself into the air, catapulted. At a certain point, Rose Roud stopped returning. She was very busy flying and being in her other realms, which she frankly preferred to the realm the spiritualists operated. The realm of hard chairs and fake smiles. The realm of death, where everyone you bother liking rots out and leaks. No, that realm was beneath her, but she still needed to eat, to drink her coffees and take her baths. And on August 4th, she sipped her first coffee of the morning, looking out at the property. Her eyes adjusted to the light. She turned on the shopping network to get ready for her day of traversing the realms, when she felt a sudden shift. For the first time in months, she tuned into the frequencies of her least favorite realm, the realm we all sit in. All at once, the truth hit her. The spiritualists were rebelling against her. Her longtime student was attempting to ascend the vortex. Her hand-chosen successor was conspiring with the gnomes. While she had been exploring new frontiers to expand her empire, her army had been staging mutiny. A rage filled Rose Roud. She turned her television off. She got up, walked to her door. She opened it. She heard the murmuring of her betrayers below. She would walk down these steps and destroy each and every one of them. She stepped outside the doorway. She looked into the blurry haze before her. What used to be her all-encompassing vista of the world was now splotches of floating gray. What used to be her elegant glide had become a painful needling in her heels. Standing in the doorway, Rose Roud realized that she was no longer meant for this realm. Her body was no longer strong. Her brain was no longer good. Rose Roud fell back into her recliner. She grabbed her remote, and she turned on the television. The event that triggered the true war was called the event. It was August 4th, 1997. Turgo Tapid spent the night leading a search for the 4 remaining gnomes. She had not managed to kill a single gnome since Bishop Garrison had slaughtered Todd, the 4th gnome. Nettie watched from the porch. The murder of Todd had destroyed all of his work in the great gnome negotiations. He also loved Todd, one of the sillier gnomes. Todd would do a very funny dance that once almost made Nettie smile. Nettie missed that dance. For an empath, grief is difficult. For an empath of Nettie's skill level, grief is a void that can't be described. Nettie felt his grief for Todd in all the realms. It was a screeching grief, a pointy, headache-inducing wait. Nettie would sometimes hide in a bublin, where he wailed. He wailed out all of his tears, all of his emotions, an orgasmic release. Nettie stood up from the porch. He felt a rising thrust of sadness. He began to walk toward the bublin, suppressing his tears. Vivid memories of Todd struck Nettie. Visions of Nettie's dead grandmother suddenly hit him as well. He would not make it to the bublin this time. He fell to the ground and screamed. Turgo Tapid looked to Nettie sobbing. This put her in a wonderful mood. She lit a cigarette and felt the night's cool breeze blow her face. Hours later, the sun rose. Bishop Garrison and Harriet Johanna, exhausted after a night of searching for gnomes, walked back toward the residence. Turgot Tappet awoke in her bedroom. She heard the television of Rose Roud blaring from the other room. Nettie and Yira sat on the porch, Yira having spent the night comforting the despondent Nettie. For the first time in years, they heard a noise from the sky, an awful, gurgling noise. It was August 5th, 1997. The event that triggered the true war was called the event. Up front, Oliver the security man watched an ugly, tacky car approach. It was the Hungarian prince, returning from his princely duties, presumably in Hungary. He had brought breakfast sandwiches for the spiritualists. "Hello, do you have an egg sandwich for me?" asked Oliver. "No, I did not bring you an egg sandwich." A great sadness filled Oliver. It was 6:22 in the morning. This is when the event occurred. Depictions of the event vary from spiritualist to spiritualist in their journal entries. Turgot Tappet described it as a spastic spark that lit the sky, creating a deafening explosive boom. Nettie Hoyt called it a fire as bright as the sun. Oliver wrote in his journal exclusively about the egg sandwich incident, infuriated that he was not considered when the egg sandwich order was placed. But the journals of the ascended Rose Roud provide the clearest depiction. On the evening of August 5th, 1997, she wrote in her journal, "Dearest Diary, it has been years since my last entry. I have been very busy in the other realms. I have figured out how to use my television to fly. I merge with the airwaves and soar through the skies like a giant airplane. I'm not sure why I hadn't thought of that before. I've spent the past few years setting up and aiming my artillery, and today I fired upon the vortex. I transformed into a psychic missile and exploded the vortex in a full-on assault. If the vortex won't allow me to ascend, if it conspires against me and plants its nasty gnomes, then I must respond. I just must. There will indeed be retaliation. This will certainly initiate the third war, and this will be the true war. But I will not partake in this war. I will be in my other, far better realms. Also, breakfast was awful today. I absolutely loathe egg sandwiches. Ew! The car's headlights went out, pitch black. She pressed her foot on the gas, felt the gravel jump around the undercarriage. Half a mile in the dark. That wouldn't be a problem. Yira Peoples didn't need light. She felt the steering wheel vibrate. She steadied it, then took a sharp right turn, pumping the brakes as she felt the car descend a steep slope. Eventually, she saw the fire in the distance. She parked. She popped the trunk. She grabbed a long cylindrical device with a sharp button. Shut the trunk. As she approached, the fire shrunk. Yira gripped the cylindrical device, called a prunt, and pointed it at the flame. She pressed the sharp button until it cut into her thumb. Blood burst. The prunt activated. The fire disappeared. Yira pulled out a tiny bottle and dipped her thumb into the potion. She didn't used to smoke, but 14 months of war had changed her. It was Halloween, 1998. The breeze was cool. She put her hand on the hood. She closed her eyes. She opened them. The headlights were back on. Yira smiled to herself. She got back into the car and drove toward the residence. She flicked her headlights off. The road plunged into dark. She pressed the gas and felt the car shake, the gravel swirling underneath her like a tornado. Yira peoples didn't need light. The true war was a heavy burden for all the spiritualists to bear. They had forged a temporary alliance among themselves. Following the event, Turgo Tappet had agreed to stop attempting to kill the gnomes in exchange for being named commander of the war efforts. Still, Nettie and Yira were coordinating behind her back, and Turgo was growing paranoid that they had gotten to Bishop Garrison and Harriet Johanna. Nettie spent hours each day in his reader chair, desperately trying to restart communications with the gnomes. Over a year of being ignored, but Nettie knew he was making progress. Each night the spiritualists had dinner. They were all cranky and had bad migraines from the vortex attacks. They were up all night dealing with the fake gnome fires. Over a year into the true war, they didn't talk to each other. They just sat in the quiet, listening to the sound of Rose Roud's television blaring from upstairs. One night, after dinner, Turgo Tappet approached Harriet Johanna and Bishop Garrison as they washed her dishes. 5 minutes, she snapped. Finish washing my dishes and meet in the projector room. 5 fucking minutes.
My soldiers, you've forsaken me. Your flirtations with our enemy. I have just one plea. Burn the reader chair of Nettie. If you find a no wish, it's squish, it's squish, it's. If you find a no wish, it's squish, it's squish, it's. You must be aware, they seek your despair. False fires and goofy bullshit. We cannot win this war until I ascend the core. So we must find over and squish them, squish them.
The gnomes have joined with the vortex. They spew fire at us, and the fool Nettie seeks friendship with them.
We should squish Nettie too. If you find a no wish, it's squish, it's squish, it's. If you find a no wish, it's squish, it's squish, it's.
Kirk Churpedley was an ugly, stupid man. His son was even uglier. This was how Rose Roud learned of her new neighbors. One day, while out for a morning walk early on in the Ascended era, she saw a terrible, ugly child in the distance, waving to her. Rose Roud would have screamed for help, but the great ignoring persisted. Later that day, she met the father of the ugly child. "Did you throw rocks at my child?" shouted Kirk. Immediately, Turgo Tappet intervened, shooing the invaders away from the Ascended Rose, off the property. Over 13 years later, on a fateful April morning, the true war would extend to the Churpedley property line. Kirk Churpedley walked to his pool. Without looking, he plopped into it, floating on his gross floaty thing. He touched his palm to the surface of the water, but something was wrong. It wasn't water in his pool. He called the police. "Those crazy psychics put pink goo in my pool," he shouted. Of course he was wrong. The goo was his own fault. Only a fool would move in so close to the vortex property, and only an even bigger fool would reject Rose Roud's offer to build a buplin for Kirk Churpedley and his ugly son. This is what Turgo Tappet said to the police when they visited the vortex property. The authorities left. But the Churpedleys had now gone too far. They had sicked the local sirens on them. Nettie sat in his room. He heard the echo of Turgo Tappet's ranting about the Churpedleys. He saw the police car drive off. He had no idea what was going on, and he didn't care. Without his reader chair, he felt a sense of hopeless he didn't know existed. As his gloom crescendoed, he thought of just leaving, abandoning Yira peoples and driving away forever. Just then he heard a noise, a terrible screeching, coming from behind his wall. It was a gnome, stuck inside the wall. The noise crystallized. It was mimicry. The gnome wailed, "Boo-hoo, boo-hoo," mocking Nettie's tears. After all Nettie had done for the gnomes, after they ignored his attempts at outreach, after all Nettie had fucking done for the goddamn gnomes. They were actually making fun of him. You see, the gnomes were angry, but gnomes only like to interact with empaths. One of the reasons for this is they thought empaths to be weak. They thought empaths to be ticklish, stupid, and touchy-feely. So now, in this moment, when Nettie was at his weakest, they directed their mockery and rage at him. But the gnomes miscalculated. Because Nettie was not just any empath. He was the strongest empath to ever live. So in that moment, on that night when the war shifted, Nettie did something extraordinary. He punched into the wall, breaking it. He crunched through the wallpaper and debris, feeling the twitching goo of the gnome. Nettie slammed the gnome to the ground before it could cease its mocking cry, and Nettie killed the gnome. He got up. He wrote a quick note and left the residence. When Yura Peoples returned to the room, she saw Nettie's note. It read, "Killed second gnome. Put the goo in the fridge. Off to kill the other 3. Be back soon." Yura Peoples and Turgo Tapid's relationship had never been good, but now it was completely, entirely soured. When Nettie left, Yura began missing Turgo's meetings. She began ignoring her duties. The insubordination began to spread. One day, Bishop Garrison arrived to Turgo's morning meeting 5 minutes late. When Turgo slapped him for this, he had the nerve to whimper loudly. The whimper rang in Turgo's ears throughout the day. As she smoked her final bathtub cigarette of the night, it hit her. There was anger in that whimper. There was rebellion in that whimper. Turgo Tapid had spent the true war putting out fake fires when the real fire blazed in front of her this whole time. She exited the bathtub, walked to Yura's bedroom, slammed on the door. Yura answered the door, saw Turgo Tapid, dripping wet, naked, smoking a cigarette. "You are conspiring against me, your commander in war." Yura Peoples stared Turgo in the eyeballs. "You are not my commander," said Yura. "A commander ascends. You have never ascended. You will never ascend. You are not my commander." Turgo Tapid stepped in. "Tomorrow, when the sky turns pink, you and me will meet at the core of this vortex, and I will incinerate you." And thus, on May 9th, as the sun set, the greatest psychic duel of the Roud era would commence. Both mentees of the ascended Rose Roud, both vying to take her place. Yura Peoples versus Turgo Tapid. The fog was too thick to see through. Kneeling down, Yura felt the wet grass and the frayed edge of the curtain. She was at the core. This would be the first ever psychic duel on the Vortex property. When she stretched her hand out, she couldn't even see her fingertips, but she felt a presence. It was Turgo across the core. As mandated by the rule of psychic duel, she put on her eye cups. Yura searched through the fog for Turgo. She was not looking through space. She was looking through realms. To an outside observer, it may seem like they merely stood there. 16 feet apart, in the fog, their eyes covered, doing absolutely nothing. And on this day, to this outside observer, it may seem like the two spiritualists stood in these spots for 11 straight hours. Just standing there, doing absolutely nothing. This is why you should never trust outside observers. They are fools. 2 ships, floating in the sea. They aimed their cannons in the dark and fired. To win a psychic duel, one must sustain. One must make precise calculations and have complete control of their inner mind. During a psychic duel in 1934, Psychic Huntley Johnson was incinerated by medium Beverly Voove when he let his mind wander for a mere second to the thought of whether he had forgotten to lock his door. Pure, uninterrupted focus was vital, but there had never been a psychic duel on the Vortex property where the energies were dangerously rich. Looking out the kitchen window, Harriet Johanna watched with Bishop Garrison eating a ravioli dish. "Do you worry that they'll die?" asked Harriet. "No," said Bishop, scooping the innards of his ravioli into a separate container. "I hope they both die." Harriet couldn't help but smile. The narrative of a psychic duel belongs to the victor. They report on the duel that took place, how they claimed victory, and their word is taken. The loser, if still alive, accepts or disputes these claims. It does not matter because only the victor's word matters. After 11 hours, the victor recorded the following. "She is lucky to be alive. Within the first attack, I claimed the upper hand. Then I beat her mercilessly. I thrust every spiritual bomb in my arsenal at her. I buried her under rubble, and then I infiltrated. I kept thrusting at her. When she begged me to finish her off, I stopped. And now she sits outside on the ground. She wishes she was incinerated. She wishes she was dead, because Turgo Tapid is something much worse. Humbled." The fire crackled. The silly man on the television made squirrel noises. When Yira Peoples informed Rose Roud that she had defeated Turgo Tapid in psychic duel, there was no response. Yira hadn't spoken a true conversation with Rose Roud in years. "I miss you," she said. "I miss Nettie too. I worry we will never find him. I worry we will remain in this state of infighting and confusion for eternity." Rose Roud blinked. A long blink. She gripped Yira Peoples' hand tight. "The acquired child," she said. "Go to my Rolodex. Bishop's bell. It is set. The Enticer must be called." Strong spiritualists absorb spiritual energies. The psychics, mediums, and empaths on the Vortex property were so skilled that they could suck them up with ease. But spiritualists can also exude these energies. They leak, dribble out like a foaming puss. A rare type of spiritualist exudes these energies like a power hose. They squirt, sprizzle, splash, and dump their energies. These are called enticers. Tucked away in the sacred Rolodex of Rose Roud was a folded hermit card. On it was a scribbled phone number. Hundreds of miles away, over the mountains and through the woods, a fancy caller identification device lit up inside of a shiny wooden office. In the adjacent dining room, Trent Hems sat at the head of a long table, hosting one of his many fantastic, fun dinner parties. Hearing the phone ring, he excused himself to the dismay of his guests, who loved spending time with him and wanted to hear more of his amazing, funny story. Trent Hems walked into his shiny office. He saw the caller identification device lighting up with the name Roud. Trent Hems' dinner guests eagerly awaited his return. They could hear him laughing from his shiny office. He eventually returned to the dining room. "Friends," said Trent Hems, his guests unable to contain their giddy smiles as they looked up at his handsome, wonderful face. "I have been summoned. Please finish your dinner and leave." And with that, Trent Hems walked out his door toward his airplane in the distance. Trent Hems was a pilot. He was a businessman. He was a stern, serious man when he wanted to be. He was a bit of a silly goof. And most importantly, Trent Hems was an enticer. He was, as you may have guessed, the most powerful enticer to ever live. When he landed on the VORTEX property, the spiritualists approached the airplane with caution. "Hello," said Trent Hems. "I am here to find your empath." He began his work immediately. An enticer had never walked on the property. Enticers percolate energies around them. They exacerbate. They exude. In the early days of Trent Hems' arrival, a sense of newfound order took hold. The infighting ceased. They found temporary structure and refuge in Trent Hems. They spent their days burying Bishop's Bell and walking the property with Trent Hems as he listened in the silence, drawing corresponding marks on a gridded sheet of paper. At night, Trent Hems hosted the spiritualists for dinner parties. They began using the projector room for movie nights and dancing instead of war planning and arguing. Suddenly, the spiritualists were spending time together, laughing, enjoying themselves. Even Turgo seemed to be having a good time. It was very odd. On the 13th day, Trent Hems rolled out a large parchment on the table. It was the Enticer map, completed. He pointed toward the edge of the map. "If your empath is any good," said Trent, "if he knows what he is doing, if he is not dead in a ditch somewhere, then he is here. You will likely find him in a bad state of mind. He will be naked, penetrating the ground. When you walk upon him, you will throw a drenched blanket over him. You will ball him up and take him back to the property, even if he squirms in the drenched blanket. Leave him in the core. I will confer with him." And so the spiritualists followed the map. It was a long, terrible walk. They argued the entire time, and they had to re-drench the heavy blanket thrice.
Damn it, the blanket's dry again!
When they finally reached the spot, they found Nettie, naked, in the bushes, face down in the dirt. Hours later, Trent Hems watched the spiritualists drag the wet, squirming blanket across the property. They dropped him in the core. Trent Hems closed the curtains of the core. Through strained eyes, Nettie squinted. A man hovered above him, ringing a bell in his face. Nettie's head throbbed. He didn't remember much, but he certainly remembered the man ringing a bell in his face. "Well, well, little Nettie, yet again you need to be saved." The water reflected the wispy clouds in the sky in a way that gave Nettie déjà vu. "Ready?" he snapped out of it. Yira was standing next to him, waiting. He grabbed his fiancée's hand and walked toward the residence. "One more gnome remains. I killed the others. This gnome wishes to make a deal with us." "A deal?" "It is a good deal." "A deal with the gnomes? I thought you were to slaughter the gnomes." "I killed Tom. I killed Sam," said Nettie. "And I was about to kill Carl," Turgo scoffed. "What a pathetic dork. You gave them fucking names?" "Shush," shushed Yira. "Carl has pointed me toward a massive ground hump on the Churpedley property. I will zench the hump, and the gnomes will allow ascension." The spiritualists exploded in commotion. Nettie was done explaining, though. He left the room and walked to the buke. Trent Hems had been soaking in the buke all day. He was the first person to be allowed in the buke since Rose Rout's semi-retirement. Yira Peoples entered the room, guiding Bishop Garrison to a couch in front of the buke. "Please," said Nettie, "sit down, Bishop." The relationship of Nettie Hoyt and Bishop Garrison was awkward. Both empaths, Bishop garnered resentment toward the much more powerful Nettie. Nettie sat next to Bishop on the couch. He held his hand. Trent Hems stepped from the butte and robed himself. "What is this about?" asked Bishop nervously. Nettie put his hand on Bishop's knee, gripped it tight. "Bishop, I saw your brother in the other realm. Isn't that nice?" Bishop smiled. "Wow, that is nice. I want you to know your brother agrees that you should give me your thumb." "What?" asked Bishop Garrison. Nettie went on to explain. Nettie indeed was in need of Bishop Garrison's thumb. It was the main request of Carl, the surviving gnome. You see, Bishop Garrison had killed Todd, and vengeance was demanded. The next 7.5 hours would be referred to as the deliberations for Bishop Garrison's thumb. Bishop Garrison was very upset. He loved his thumb. Nettie assured him, "Carl will take good care of your thumb." Serving as mediator, Trent Hems spoke. "Are there no other ways to appease the gnome?" "No," said Nettie. "Ah, darn," said Trent. Throughout the deliberations, Nettie gripped Bishop's knee. Yira rubbed his back. Trent Hems squeezed his shoulder. The Hungarian prince burst into the room. "What are you doing to him?" he screamed. The Hungarian prince begged Bishop Garrison, "Do not give them your thumb. You love your thumb. We love your thumb." Oliver the security man escorted the Hungarian prince out of the room. Sacrifice had been a constant for Bishop Garrison. He had sacrificed his brother to the vortex. He had sacrificed his dignity to the vortex. And now he was asked to sacrifice yet another thing he cherished, his thumb. He felt the spiritualists rubbing him, gripping him, pinching his cheeks. They were touching him a lot. The touching had gotten rapid, constant. They played him as if he were some strange, poorly tuned instrument. A numbness overcame Bishop Garrison, and then he felt a vibration in his skull. It rang like a bell. "What happens if I say no?" asked Bishop. Nettie let go of Bishop's hand. Blood oozed. He held the detached thumb of Bishop Garrison. "If you say no," said Nettie, putting Bishop's bloody thumb into a plastic baggie held by Yira, "then I'll come back and take your other fucking thumb for myself." "Knock, knock," said the man through the door. "Knock, knock," said the man through the door. When he opened his door, Kirk Churpedley was splashed with falling rain. Leading his guest to the dining room table, he stopped to peer out at his swimming pool anxiously. "Is your swimming pool okay?" asked his guest. Grumbled Kirk Churpedley. "Well, anyways, I made a stew." "Oh, good," said his guest. Trent Hems pulled out a bottle of wine. "Do you have glasses?" "Yes," said Kirk, "but I don't like to drink." "Nonsense," said Trent Hems. "This wine is too good to miss, and I can tell you are stressed about your swimming pool." Kirk looked out to his swimming pool, flashing in the lightning, rain dumping down on it. Perhaps a drink would take the edge off. Outside, the rain poured heavy on Nettie Hoyt. He walked to the steepest angle of the hill, at the base, put his hand into the wet grass, pressed. His hand sank into the grass, into the gooey dirt. His arm was inside the hill, his shoulder. He felt the earth absorb him, suck him up. For a brief moment he couldn't breathe. He almost choked on the rain. The grass, the dirt, the goo. The sound of rain stopped. Nettie was inside the hump. From a distance, Yira Peoples looked through her binoculars. She was waiting for the signal. That was the signal. The television of Rose Roud played a strange show. Yira Peoples walked into the room, gave the ascended Rose a loving kiss on the eyeball, walked to the button, lifted it, turned the knob to the designated number. Beneath the Churpedley house was a hill, but this hill was not, in actuality, a hill. It was a ground hump. And now, in this moment, while Trent Hems distracted Kirk, while the spiritualists descended on the Churpedley property, Nettie Hoyt zenched this hump. Above, Kirk Churpedley laughed heartily. Trent Hems was making a very silly face and doing a funny dance. Trent Hems poured more wine for Kirk. "So, why do you spend your time with those weirdo psychics?" asked Kirk. Skeps are non-believers in the Vortex world. They are very foolish, often ugly people. Skeps are best to be avoided. But Trent Hems was an enticer. He was especially skilled at talking to Skeps. So Trent Hems coolly sat next to Kirk, overflowing his wine glass. "They aren't just weirdos," said Trent. "They're downright crazy. Do you know they believe that your house is actually not sitting on a hill, but rather a bubbling formation of ectoplasmic goo called a ground hump?" Kirk gasped. "Those freaks! How dare they even think such disgusting thoughts of my property?" "I tell you, Kirk, good friend," said Trent, "one of them actually plans to get naked and dig a hole into the base of your hill, and he will burrow inside, performing an act known as zenching. He will zench the hump." This was all too much for Kirk. He saw the storm worsening outside. Flashing in the lightning, he could have sworn he saw someone in his yard. When he alerted Trent Hems of this, Trent Hems laughed. "Dear Kirk, you really are drunk, aren't you? Say, how about we do some shots of alcohol and then chocolate syrup?" Trent Hems then began dumping shots of tequila down Kirk's throat, followed by a spoonful of thick chocolate syrup. It was a delicious, jolly experience, and it provided time. Time for Turgot Tappet to drive the pickup truck into position. Time for her and Harriet Johanna to get the keradisk off the bed of the truck and dug into the proper position. Half a mile away, Bishop Garrison fell headfirst into the soggy mud. He got back up, grabbed the wire, unspooled it as he forged along in the dark, hard rain. He had much longer to go. He was tired. His hand hurt. At a certain point in his trek, Bishop Garrison wondered how he got here, to this place, but he kept walking. To zench a hump is an incredibly difficult task. A skept may even think it's sexual. To get nude, to involve oneself in the orifices, goos, and vibrations of the realms between. Kirk Churpedley laughed as Trent Hems told him a long, engaging story. It was the best story Kirk Churpedley had ever heard. It had magic, gossip, and hilarious sexual innuendos in it. And even though he was drunk and distracted, he couldn't help but be enthralled. He felt his stomach sink, as if the floor was lowering. The lightning flashed. He saw the horizon rise. Perhaps he had drunk too much tequila and chocolate syrup. A truck drove off his property, mud flinging in its aftermath. Kirk blinked. There! Someone is out there!" said Kirk drunkenly. He wobbled to the ground. "The hill is sinking! The hill is sinking! Oh my gosh!" Trent Hems chuckled as Kirk Churpedley began vomiting all over his kitchen. The hill was not, in actuality, sinking. The hump was being zenched. The ground hump collapsed. Nettie Hoyt emerged, covered in goo. A wave of spiritual energies exploded from the hump, dispersing across the properties. Bishop Garrison finally saw the second keradisk in the distance. He connected the wire to the keradisk. He fell to the ground, exhausted. Kirk Churpedley woke up. He was tucked into his bed. Trent Hems entered the room. "Good morning, Sleepy," he said. "Come outside. I have something to show you." Head pounding, Kirk followed the Enticer outside. When his eyes adjusted to the morning sun, he saw it. Pink, gurgling, bubbling ectoplasmic goo covered his property. A fire blazed by his garage. He turned to Trent, tears streaming down his stupid, ugly face. "What happened?" "You got drunk and we had a very fun dinner party." "But look," said Trent, "your swimming pool is completely fine." October 11th, 2000. The grass was dewy. The sky was blue. Yira Peoples sat in the core of the vortex, wrapped in ascension fabric. She had been waiting here all night. She did not know it, but the hump had been cinched. The Battle of Churpedley Hill had been won. When Nettie made his way back to the property, covered in goo, he looked out longingly to the curtain encircling his wife in the distance at the core. But he could not distract her while she waited to ascend. So he kept walking on toward the other spiritualists convening in the residence. Tergo Tappet approached Nettie. She handed him a spoonful of gelatin on a fork. Without question, Nettie ate it. Tergo Tappet put the palm of her hand over Nettie's face and gripped it tight. Nettie felt all the residue of the zenching come off him. He felt the soreness lift, his blood rejuvenate warmth and flow. "Thank you, Tergo," said Nettie. Tergo blew smoke in Nettie's face. The Hungarian prince brought out breakfast for everyone. They gathered around the table. Trent Hems poured coffee with potion cream. While they had won the Battle of Churpedley Hill, tension hung in the air. The true war would only end with ascension. The only recorded ascension was May 2nd, 1983. It took Rose Roud 5 hours and 21 minutes. She returned 36 minutes later. "Do you think she'll ascend?" asked Harriet Johanna. The spiritualists argued. Trent Hem spoke up. "Do not forget, the vortex summoned her. Rose Roud is never wrong. The acquired child will ascend." Trent Hems spoke with a reassurance that soothed the room. They all drank the Enticer's delicious coffee. Trent Hems approached Nettie Hoyt. "How are you holding up, old friend?" asked Trent. Nettie looked out at the vortex core. The drapery folded around her, layer by layer of fabric. Then she felt the fabric unspool. The fabric unraveled and unraveled until she pressed against it and broke through. An eternity went by. She was lost in a strange daydream that never ended, staring at the blurry line on the horizon. Throughout this eternity, a figure on the horizon slowly came into focus. Yira Peoples was no longer Yira Peoples. She was a piece of goo poking from the wet sand. No, she was an eyeball. Vibrations emitted. The figure began to sway. In a sea of eyeballs, infinite, the entity grew in size, in brightness, in power. Even though she was only an eyeball in this realm, she felt a sinking in her stomach. She felt a tickle in her groin. She felt a pulsating draw toward this strange entity in the distance. A sense of love she had never felt before. In this moment, she knew what she had to do. She had to get the entity's attention. but there were so many eyeballs. She squinted at the entity, for that was all she could do in her new eyeball form. To Yira peoples, in her eyeball form, it seemed as though decades passed, with her drifting off staring at the entity's dance, until she came to a realization. Yira peoples was no longer Yira peoples. She was all the eyeballs. She squinted, not just with one eyeball, but with all of the eyeballs. The entity turned, and it saw her. While she was many eyeballs, she had no mouth, no arms, so she could not shout, "I love you" to the entity. She could not give it a hug. The entity stared at her vast sea of twitching eyeballs, scattered and deformed across the wet sand. Yira peoples had to strain in this moment, to keep control of all the eyeballs, to keep from lulling into a demented slumber. It was almost as if the entity wanted her to drift away. But something inside of her cooed throughout the realms. Kill it. No, she couldn't. She loved it. Yira peoples had not known what ascension would feel like, what it would be. But now she was here. She had no idea it would be like this. So wonderful. So ticklish on so many eyeballs. The entity's vibrations soothing her in places that did not exist in the other earthly realm. She wanted to scream with laughter, but all she could form were a flood of tears. The entity grew larger, its vibrations tingling intensely. I am all the eyeballs. I am the goo. I am the sand. I am the sky. I am the entity. She ascended once more above. She saw the spiraling core of the vortex. As the entity, she had new abilities of communication, transcendent forms of communication that defy speech, that defy orgasm. As she stared into the core of the vortex, she felt the dizzying sense of weight, the vibrations of another realm. She could have sworn she saw her dead mother, or maybe that was a blimp in the sky, its spotlight enveloping Yira. A message came through that spotlight. It felt like a sweet song reverberating inside of her. She looked down. She saw the vortex below her, swirling, spewing. She felt its energy, its radiance, its power. She did not know in this moment, but these were the negotiations. She did not know in this moment, but she was, in this eternal daydream into the swirling core, seeing the vortex for what it truly was. Seeing death for what it truly was. Back on the property, the fabric unspooled around her. She saw lights on in the residence. She took the back door and snuck upstairs to the room at the end of the hall. The television of Rose Roud blared loudly. Yira people sat next to her. Held her hand. They looked into each other's eyeballs.